Your life is limited. Do not waste your last breath. Buddha's hardest truth. We have so little time. As the Buddha said, even if you have a long life, it's 100 years, which may seem long. But as you're approaching the end, you look back and it's nothing. Time eats everything as it eats itself. We're encouraged to have unlimited mind states, unlimited goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity. But our resources are limited, our time, our energy, which means that we have to choose our issues very carefully. Notice that after the Buddha's awakening, the issue that he focused on was one that all of us have in common, which is that we want happiness and yet our actions lead to suffering. And unlike some teachers who try to make us embarrassed about our desire for happiness or denounce it as selfish, he said that there's nothing wrong with the desire for happiness. It's just that we go about it the wrong way. He also said that if you can focus on this issue and clear up this issue, you take care of everything else. So we have to look at the issues we carry into the practice. Old wounds, old battles, old issues. How many of them are worth carrying or continuing to carry? How many issues can we take on and actually handle properly? We hear about people who find that they only have a few months left to live and they suddenly change their way of living. They get a sense of what's important to them and what's not, and they let the unimportant things fall aside. It's good that they do this, but it's a shame that they had to wait until the last 3 months. As the Buddha said, you should be prepared to go at any time, which means you have to really pare down your issues right now. I was reading a while back about a woman general in the army who every day at the beginning of the day would make a list of the 10 most important things that had to be done that day, in order of importance. Then she would strike out the last 8 and focus on the first 2. The Buddha would have you focus on 1. What's the cause of your suffering right now? Where is your suffering? This is not a selfish issue to focus on, because if you can't handle your own suffering, it tends to spill out onto other people. So we owe it both to ourselves and to others to focus on what we're doing that's unskillful and have some goodwill for ourselves to see that our desire for happiness is something to be honored, something to be aspired to. But we want to make it a genuine happiness, a solid happiness, a reliable happiness, a harmless happiness. In other words, we really wish ourselves well. We get practice with the breath. The other day, we were talking about having an issue with being friends with your breath. If you can't be friends with your breath, how are you going to be friends with anybody? You have to stop and ask yourself, what's the problem? Is the breath the problem, or is it something else inside? A lot of us come from other traditions where we're taught to think very little of ourselves, and we either accept that or react in the opposite direction. But neither of those attitudes is helpful. Simply wish yourself well. So little time. As for the question of whether you or anyone else deserves to be happy, the Buddha never talked about deserving. He was here to put an end to suffering, whether deserved or not. That's pretty radical. You know the story about Angulimala, who had killed 999 people and then, not long after the Buddha taught him, became an arahant. A lot of people like that story. It shows that no matter what your background, there's hope. But we have to remember that, at the time, there were a lot of people who didn't like what had happened and were pretty upset. Here was Angulimala, who had killed all these people, and he was literally getting away with murder. You could say that he deserved to suffer, but the Buddha didn't take that into consideration at all. He said, here's a person who's suffering really badly, and his suffering is spilling out and affecting other people. By curing Angulimala's suffering, or showing him how to cure his suffering, he saved a lot of other people too. So if there's the question of whether you deserve to be happy or not, you learn how to put that aside. Realize that that's a non-issue. The issue is that you've got actions. The mind is an active principle. This is something Ajahn Mun talked about a lot. As he said, the mind flows out. There's the source of the mind, like the source of a river. Things keep flowing out, and that's the problem. It's not that things outside are coming in to cause problems. The problem is in the way we flow out toward things, and it's not going to stop unless we learn how to do it really skillfully. Our actions are really, really important. There was a teaching current in the time of the Buddha to the effect that the only real things in the world are the basic elements: earth, water, wind, fire. They had a few other elements as well, but the elements were the only things that existed. Actions were non-existent. Thoughts were non-existent. This also meant that there was no basis for precepts. As they said, when a knife went through somebody's neck, it just went between the atoms, so there was nobody there to be killed, and the movement of the knife was unreal. Only permanent things were real. The Buddha's teachings are the other way around. Your actions are what are real, that have the most reality. The world out there is not the issue. The world that you experience comes from your actions. Your actions are more solid, more powerful than your experience of earth, wind, water, fire, and all the other elements. That's a pretty radical statement. This is why the Buddha keeps focusing back on what you're doing right now, because what you're doing right now is the big shaping force in your experience. And all of us, regardless of our past, regardless of what other people have told us, have the perfect right to learn how to act skillfully, to find happiness. So learn to see the issue of genuine happiness as the big issue. Learn to see the issue of genuine suffering as the big issue too. They go together, and have some goodwill for your own happiness. It's interesting that when the Buddha talks about people who are wealthy but extremely miserly and frugal, he doesn't say that it's really good that they've learned how to put aside sensual desires. He said there's something really wrong with them. If they can't learn how to appreciate some pleasures for themselves, how are they going to appreciate other people's having pleasure? They're going to be jealous. They're going to be resentful. So he does encourage sensory pleasure in moderation. He says there are pleasures that are perfectly harmless for the mind. You have to look at your own mind, though, to figure out which ones are harmless for you and which ones are not, because it's not the same for everyone. And then you realize that even though harmless pleasures give some relief to the mind, they don't leave it fully satisfied. What would be a higher level of pleasure? The word sukha runs everywhere from just plain old physical pleasure, ease, well-being, all the way up to bliss. Nibbana is the ultimate sukha. The Buddha doesn't want you to be afraid of pleasure. He says to learn how to appreciate which pleasures are actually helpful for you on the path to the ultimate pleasure, and which ones get in the way. The same with pains. Some pains are helpful for you on the path. You want to learn how to use both pleasure and pain, and not be overcome by either. But the purpose of all this is to create in the mind a state of genuine well-being in concentration. When you have that well-being, what misery is there to slosh out on other people? For most of us, we're miserable, and we slosh our misery out on others, thinking that we're lightening our load, but it just makes things worse. Well, you can take care of the source of this sloshing stuff inside. You benefit. The people around you benefit. When the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, they weren't just four interesting facts about an interesting problem. He said that this is the big issue, the fact that you're causing yourself suffering, but you have the ability to learn how not to. So, given the little time that we have, it's important that we focus our energy on solving the problem that's the big problem. The problem that, once it's solved, gets everything else solved. Look at your attitude toward happiness. Look at your attitude toward suffering, and see if you can bring those attitudes in line. The Dhamma that the Buddha taught is for the purpose of putting an end to suffering and for finding true happiness. These are the issues that are important. Anything that gets in the way of those issues, you can put aside. We read about those people in the time of the Buddha who came to him with this questionnaire. Is the world eternal? Is the world not eternal? Is it finite? Is it infinite? Is the soul the same thing as the body? Is it different? What happens to awakened people after death? Do they exist? Not exist both, neither? And to us, the questionnaire looks very bizarre. Yet we tend to have our own issues, and sometimes they're even stranger than that. There was the monk who said he wouldn't practice the Buddha's teachings unless the Buddha gave his answer to those questions. The Buddha said, "Well, you're going to die before you hear me answer those questions." We all know the story about the arrow. The man is shot by the arrow and he tells the doctor, "I'm not going to take the arrow out until I've found out who made the arrow, what wood it was made out of, what kind of feathers it was made with, and what was the caste of the person who shot me." The man would die before he learned the answers to those questions. We see other people's issues as ridiculous in that way. We have to learn to see a lot of our own issues as ridiculous in that way too. The issues that are getting in the way of our gaining the most from the fact that we've been exposed to the Buddha's teachings and we have the chance to practice them, at least for now. To escape the prison of time. My background in school was in intellectual history, what's sometimes called the history of ideas. And one of the basic premises of intellectual history is that if you want to understand a person's thought, you have to know when he or she lived and what the other people of the time were thinking. The underlying premise there, of course, is that each person is a prisoner of his or her own time. It was a rare individual who could think outside the box. Sometimes the box would change just a little bit, and then the new box would become the prison for the people of the next generation. But somehow the practice of intellectual history itself seemed to be standing outside of time. In other words, they'd figured out all the other times, but somehow it was more objective and wasn't subject to its own rules. When I met Ajahn Fuang, that got all overturned. I began to realize that I was a prisoner of my own time. It took a while, though. When I first went to Thailand and learned about Buddhism, people were telling me that the Buddha taught the truth about this, the truth about that. But my background kept telling me, well, he saw the truth through the lens of his own time. He might have some useful insights for us now, but we'd have to bring him up to date. But as I said, meeting Ajahn Fuang overturned that. I realized that I was a prisoner of my own time, and that the Buddha was the one who'd stepped out of time. After all, in his awakening, he did step outside of space and time. He saw that there was a happiness that existed outside of space and time, but it could be attained by the actions we do in space and time. The event of his awakening was the primary event in world history, and the insights he gained are always valid. As he said at one point, the knowledge he gained in his awakening was like the leaves in a forest, but what he taught was a handful of leaves. He taught that handful of leaves because it would be of use to people to put an end to their own suffering. The parts he didn't teach wouldn't have been useful for that purpose. There's one passage where he talks about the many powers he gained through his awakening, but there are three in particular that he kept repeating over and over again in his autobiographical accounts of his awakening. One was knowledge of previous lifetimes. The second was knowledge of how beings, after their death, are reborn in line with their karma. And the third was the knowledge of how to put an end to the effluents. In other words, the currents of defilement that come flowing out of the mind and that lead to more becoming and more suffering. Those are the three knowledges that he found most useful to talk about. Then, of course, after gaining those knowledges, he gained awakening to nibbana, which is something deathless. Faith in the Buddha, conviction in the Buddha's awakening, is a really good investment. Those are all the premises we need. You might think of them as premises for skillful action. This is why faith in the Buddha's awakening, or conviction in the Buddha's awakening is so important. We don't like the word faith. It's become the F word in modern Buddhism, but there are certain things we have to believe if we want to find true happiness. One is that our course through life doesn't begin with this particular birth or end with the death of this body. It's been ongoing for a long time, and it's going to continue to be ongoing unless we put a stop to it. This means that when we plan an action, we have to consider the very long-term consequences, not only in this lifetime but also into future ones. From the second knowledge, we have the principle that how we are reborn is going to be determined by our actions, which are intentions, which in turn are determined by our views. And our views, of course, are going to be determined by the extent to which we have respect for the noble ones. We give them trust because the basic principle they teach is that actions based on greed, aversion, and delusion will lead to suffering. Actions based on an absence of those mental qualities will lead in the direction of happiness. So we have to look at the intentions in our minds and the motivations for why we're acting. That's where we'll find what makes a difference between a course of action that leads to suffering and a course of action that leads away from suffering. Finally, from the third knowledge, there's the principle that if we focus on the problem of suffering and its cause, and if we learn the path of action that can put an end to its cause, we'll find true happiness. And a large part of that path of action is right view. When the Buddha gave the most succinct statement of his awakening, it was the principle of causality. When this is, that is, from the arising of this comes the arising of that. When this isn't, that isn't, from the passing away of this comes the passing away of that. That's the principle of causality underlying right view. Actually, it's two principles of causation interacting, one in which causes and their effects arise at the same time and disappear at the same time, and another in which there's causality over time. Something you do now will lead to a result later on. The experience of the present moment is a combination of those two. If you think about those principles, you realize that they open the way for freedom of choice. If everything were determined by your past actions, you'd have no freedom, but there is something in the present moment that allows you to come up with something now that will have an effect now and on into the future. Now, because there's a pattern to what is skillful and unskillful, but there's also room to adjust the forces of cause and effect, you have principle that provides the possibility for learning skills. After all, if there were no pattern, then what you learn today wouldn't help you at all tomorrow. If the pattern were ironclad, in other words, totally predetermined, you'd have no choice to even try to develop a skill. But here, there's a pattern with room for choice, which opens the possibility for developing the path as a skill. It's something we can choose to do. These are all basic premises we need for having trust in the principle that our actions will make a difference and that we can learn skills that will give better and better results. This is what the Buddha brought back from stepping outside of time. And the best results of acting on his premises are that your actions take you to a threshold, beyond which you're outside of time too. So you can use actions within time to get out of time, which is where the best happiness is, because any happiness that's in time is going to disappear as time changes. After all, where's the body you had 20 years ago, 10 years ago? Where are your feelings? You may have memories of the past, but they're very much subject to change and can often be unreliable. You look within time and you can find very little solidity, very little opportunity to settle in and say, okay, this is a good, safe place. If you're really serious about happiness, the only happiness that's really going to be satisfactory will have to be a happiness that's outside of space and time. So these are the Buddha's premises on the nature and the power of action. Now, he never said he could prove them to you, aside from getting you to follow his teachings and proving them for yourself. In the very beginning, he said, it's like a gamble, but it's a good bet, a safe bet. He listed a whole series of practices about which he said that if you take them on, and it turns out that he was wrong, at the very least, you still lead a blameless life. Like developing the 4 Brahmaviharas, you develop goodwill for all, compassion for all, empathetic joy, equanimity, all around. When you do, your actions are bound to be more skillful, less harmful. If it turns out there is no rebirth or actions don't have consequences, then at the very least you can be honorable in your intentions. For instance, say you believe in the principle of the power of action, that you have choices. You reflect that if you believe that you didn't have any choices, that belief would close the door to the possibility of any path of practice. If you accept as a working hypothesis that your actions will make a difference, that opens possibilities. So if your basic premises for your actions require that you place bets as to what would be the most fruitful premises, it's good to gamble on the ones that open more possibilities, because you don't want to close honorable opportunities off simply because you don't know. So the possibility of stepping outside of becoming, putting an end to becoming and going beyond it, that's something you take on as a working hypothesis. In other words, you place your bets on the idea that a deathless happiness is possible. That's a safer hypothesis than saying it's not possible. If you believe it's not possible, you're never going to do the actions that might possibly take you there. Now, if it turns out that it's not true that the deathless is attainable, still, you've lived an honorable life. So even at the very beginning, it's a good bet. But it doesn't stay just a bet. Some people say, well, here the Buddha himself is saying he doesn't really know. He's not saying that at all. He's saying that people who approach the path are coming in ignorance, and they have to decide whether they're going to gamble on the path or not, because action is a gamble. There's so much we don't know. But the Buddha is offering a possibility that your thoughts, your words, and your deeds have the potential to lead to something beyond them. Then you follow the path, and as he said, the point at which you step outside of time yourself, that's when you've proven for yourself that what the Buddha said was true. From that point on, you have what he calls verified confidence in his awakening. You have a witness, your own experience, and you realize that what he said about suffering coming from within was true. This knowledge is implicit in the principle of the Dhamma I. Whatever is subject to origination is all subject to cessation. Now notice this statement is not saying everything that arises is going to cease or pass away. Subject to origination means caused, and when the Buddha uses the word origination, it's almost always in the context of things caused from within the mind. What's radical about the experience of the deathless is that you begin to see how even your experience of the 6 senses is originated. In other words, there are conditions that flow from within that determine how you're going to see and hear and smell and taste and touch and think about things. When those internal causes are ended, your connection with the world of the senses ends as well. At least it stops for the time being, and that's what opens the possibility for an experience of the deathless. It's from that experience that even that thought, all that is subject to origination, would naturally occur as a valid realization. In other words, you're not just making a vague generalization about things in general. You've seen something that's not subject to origination and is also not subject to cessation. You realize that it's radically different from everything else you've ever experienced. Everything else you've experienced prior to that falls into whatever is subject to origination. As for your verified confidence in the Buddha, you realize that your experience of time didn't start with the date of your birth, but that it stretches for a long time before then. You may not have specific memories of previous lifetimes, but you get a new perspective on time by stepping out of it. And then you realize that, yes, it was your actions, the choices you've made, that allowed you to step out in this way. which is why your virtues now become virtues pleasing to the noble ones. They're solid, they're sure, but at the same time, you don't create a sense of pride around them. As the Buddha says, you don't make yourself out of the virtues. You use them as tools to reach full awakening. Then there's the fact that there is an awareness that's there, even as the aggregates fall away. After all, the aggregates are, as the Buddha said, near and far, past, present, and future. In other words, they're in the coordinates of space and time, but there's still an awareness, even after those coordinates fade away. So there's no reason why you'd ever want to identify with the aggregates or build an identity around them ever again. It's in this way that you're freed from certain fetters, even with just the first taste of the deathless. What's especially good is that you're freed of your doubt. You've seen for yourself that what the Buddha said is true. You realize that his awakening really was the main event in world history, and that the knowledge he shared based on his awakening is knowledge worth taking to heart, worth having faith in, worth testing to see if what he said was really true. If you're still at the very beginning where you don't know, at the very least you look at the path and can see that it's an honorable path. It allows you to hold yourself pure, at least in terms of your intentions, and that's a lot to begin with right there. This is why he said the path is admirable in the beginning, admirable in the middle, admirable in the end. It starts by your dedicating yourself to the purity of your intentions, and it leads to something that goes beyond intentions, something really worth experiencing for yourself. So, faith in the Buddha, conviction in the Buddha's awakening is a really good investment. It pays off in more ways than you can imagine. The flow of time. According to the Indian astrological calendar, the year begins when the sun moves into Aries. In the way they calculate the houses and the constellations, it'll be on the 13th. There's nothing specifically Buddhist about that. What is Buddhist is the little ceremony where people dedicate merit to ancestors who've passed away, because that's something you have to think about when you mark time. You think about the people who've died. Of course, you can't help but thinking as well, they died. You're going to die. Time slips away. Each time we have a new year, it means we're that much older. And you have to ask yourself, what do you get out of it? The body wears down. You don't function quite as well as you used to. As they say in Thailand, I think it's from a passage in the canon, but I'm not really sure. Time consumes all beings as it consumes itself. In other words, where is last year? You can't really locate it anywhere. And it's taken certain strengths out of your body. So what do you have left? Time flows like water. It's like trying to catch a river in your hand. Most of it slips right through. No matter how much you cup the hand, the water's going to slip through. All you've got are your actions, the things you've done, said, and thought. These are the things you gather out of the water as it passes. So you have to ask yourself, what are you gathering? Gathering good things out of the water or just gathering the scum and weeds? Think of time as presenting you with opportunities. You have choices. Each time you breathe in, each time you breathe out, you're making choices. Many choices, some of which go under the radar, others of which you're more conscious of. Are you making the best use of your choices, of your time? These are the kinds of things you have to think about. Because as the Buddha said, even if you live 100 years, it's a very short period of time. When it's gone, you don't have 100 years stashed away in a bag someplace. They've gone. So given that we have a short period of time, limited strength, limited time, what's the best use of those things? The Buddha said the best use lies in training the mind because everything you do and say and think comes out of the mind. And you don't want your mind to be run by impulses. You want it to think of the long term. This is the beginning of wisdom and discernment when you ask that question, what, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? It's wise because 1, you realize it's going to depend on your actions. 2, you realize that long-term happiness is possible. And 3, you want long-term. So you've got to learn how to train the mind not to go just for the short term. What on impulse seems like it'd be fun or interesting or something that you just feel like you've got to do without really knowing why. You want some strength of mind to step back from those impulses and understand where they're coming from. One of the reasons why we work with the breath, in addition to giving the mind a place to settle down, is that a lot of impulses come because something strange has gotten into your breath energy. The part of the mind that pushes for greed, aversion, and delusion knows how to squeeze the breath and to make you feel that you've got to give in. So you've got to learn how to undo the squeeze. Work on breathing in a way that feels spacious, that feels soothing to the body, strengthening to the body, calming you when you're upset, relaxing you when you're tense, energizing you when you're tired. That gives you a source of strength right here in the present moment. It makes it easier to look at the long term. There are a lot of issues where we don't know what the long-term results will be, but there are also a lot where we do. One of the reasons the Buddha gives the precepts is to remind us: killing, stealing, illicit sex, lying, taking intoxicants, all these are for long-term harm, regardless of the situation. So once you've got the basic principles down, then you have to look more carefully. What little things are not included in the precepts? What are the areas where the skillful course of action is not so absolute and depends instead on time and place? It's because of these issues that we have to develop mindfulness and alertness so that we can see for ourselves what's skillful, and to remember that we've got to look for the long term. Whatever lessons we've learned from reliable people or from our own experience, you want to be able to bring them to bear in your choices right now. Sometimes you hear the teaching that each moment is totally unique, and so nothing you learn from the past can help you, that you have to just go by your instinct, the first thought that comes into your mind. Well, that's a recipe for impulse. It's not a recipe for wisdom. The Buddha said there are patterns. This is why he taught the 4 noble truths. They're noble because they always apply. The nature of suffering is always the same. The cause of suffering is always the same. The path to the end of suffering is always the same. And what it means to put a cessation to suffering, that's always the same. These truths are timeless. They allow us to step back from the flow of time and to see, what are you doing with your time? What is the best thing to do with the flow of time as it flows away? We train our minds focusing on the breath, letting the breath be comfortable, trying to develop a sense of feeling at home here in the present moment and not letting ourselves be pushed around by impulses that come in. Ajahn Chah has a nice image for this. You're sitting here in the one chair in your house. Don't let anybody else slip into the chair, because if they do, they'll start ordering you around. If you're in the chair, you're sitting down. Other people coming into the house have to stand. You can tell them where to stand, and you can tell them where to go. So sitting here with the breath, fully occupying your body in the present moment, that's the one chair in the house. Don't let greed come in and take over the chair, or anger or lust or any desires that you know are unskillful, because you want to be able to stay in control. Stay here, stable, knowing that you have the skills to undercut any impulses that come into the mind, and that at least part of you knows will cause trouble down the line. This way, you make the best use of time. You take these truths that are timeless and you try to apply them to your life in a timeless way, not just while you're sitting and meditating, but also as you go through the day. Where is there stress? Where is there suffering in the mind? And what are you doing? It's all too easy to blame your sufferings on people outside, but that's not in line with the 4 noble truths. You have to turn and look at yourself. What are you doing right now? Where is it unskillful? What can you do to change it? This is not to say that you're bad, simply that this is the way to solve the problem. If the problem were dependent on getting other people to be a certain way, you'd really be bad off, because other people have freedom of choice too. They can do what they want. If you spend your time straightening out the world, it's like that story they tell of the hungry ghost up in the rafters in the meditation sala. A group of people come to spend the night at the monastery, and they're lying in a row in the sala. The hungry ghost, up in the rafters, looks down and sees that their heads are not even. So he goes down and pulls them so their heads are even. Then he gets up in the rafters and looks down. Oh no, their feet are not even. So he goes down and pulls them by the feet until the feet are all lined up. He gets up the rafters. Oh, the heads are not lined up anymore. All night long. In other words, you could straighten out the world, but it would never get straight. And as in the story, the hungry ghost doesn't get any sleep, and the people trying to sleep don't get any sleep either. But if you learn how to straighten yourself out, realizing that that's where the problem is and that's also where the solution is, things are a lot easier for everyone. So train the mind. Use the breath as your ally in this so that you're strong enough to see things in the long term, so that with the passage of years you realize that how many years it takes doesn't really matter, because you've got a timeless goal and a timeless way of looking at things, of understanding what needs to be done, what doesn't need to be done. This is how you see the long term. You step out of time and depend on a teaching that's timeless. That's what the Dhamma has to offer.